Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this workshop on citizen science in areas affected by armed conflict. My name is Leonie, and we're facilitating this event from the Conflict and Environment Observatory, which is a charity working to reduce the harm to people and ecosystems from armed conflict and military activities. We're based in a small village in West Yorkshire in the currently fairly divided kingdom of not so Great Britain. We're very disappointed not to be meeting some of you in Trieste this week, especially after we saw some of the menus for the delicious lunches that we're not getting served. But also we had planned for this session to be quite an interactive workshop during which we would together design a citizen or civilian science project in a region affected by armed conflict. Obviously things haven't quite worked out like that, so instead we'd like to introduce you to the idea of civilian science, hear some perspectives from people in conflict zones, and invite you to ask questions and share your knowledge, experience and perspectives. Our speakers today are Dr. Mirella Di Lorenzo from the University of Bath, who'll be talking to us about water quality monitoring in areas affected by gold mining in the Colombian Amazon. Dr. Mohamed Farah from ECOSOC, which is an environmental social enterprise based in Mogadishu, Somalia. Professor Mazin Qumsiyeh from the Palestine Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability at Bethlehem University. Please post your questions to the chat as people are talking. We're particularly interested in drawing out in the discussion key challenges in this area and possible tools to address them. So if you could think of this when you're formulating your questions, that would be great. At the end of the presentations and before the Q&A, my colleague Owen Derbyshire will be providing us with a synthesis of the key challenges identified by the speakers. We'd love for this to be the start of a conversation and one that will continue beyond the conference. So we'll be in the Zoom coffee break room after the session and hope to meet some of you there. We'll also have a sign-up form for you to send your details if you'd like to stay in touch, and we'll post this to the chat. We're incredibly grateful to our presenters today and would also like to thank the conference organisers for giving us this platform. I now hand you over to my colleague Doug Weir, our Research and Policy Director, to introduce the theme of the session. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you, Leonie. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Just want to talk a little bit about civilian science. And just give you a little bit of introduction to what we're talking about. Sorry, just sorting out the audio in the office. There we are. Excellent. Right, without further ado. So very briefly just about us. We're a small charity in the UK, and we work to increase the protection of people and ecosystems from the impact of armed conflicts and military activities. So our work involves monitoring and raising awareness of harmful incidents and activities. So we do quite a lot of Earth observation, remote sensing. We also kind of develop tools to increase data collection. Quite a lot of this is around Earth observation, but we're also very interested in these citizen science approaches and new ways, new methodologies of getting data. And we also do quite a lot of work on the kind of legal and policy side by looking at legal framework and policies which are intended to reduce harm to the environment during conflict. So why do we need to study environmental change in conflicts? So we see in pretty much every conflict around the world that environmental harm, it creates direct and indirect threats to the health, ecosystems and to livelihoods. Some of this is quite obvious. You know, you've all probably seen footage of industrial damage, bombed petrochemical plants, chemical plants, damage to urban infrastructure, places like Homs in Syria, where we see huge amounts of urban devastation, and there's very little data about the environmental health risks in these areas. We also see impacts on the natural environment, so we see destroyed habitats and loss of species. There's a few occasions where conflicts can be beneficial for biodiversity by keeping humans out and slowing human development, but overall we tend to see a very negative impact, particularly when we see governance collapsing and the protections which should be in place no longer in place. And then also resource exploitation, which I think Morelo will touch on in the context of Colombia. So we look at extractives in conflict areas, which can be highly damaging, particularly. And this question of governance collapse. So this is an issue which obviously develops during a conflict, but it can go on for years and decades after the conflict, was the environmental protections within a country are set back and delayed by the presence of armed violence. So altogether, there are kind of these multi-dimensional ways in which the environment and by extension people can be harmed during conflicts. So how can we study it at the moment? So obviously, there are a lot of issues around conflict areas, security and access constraints. We often see a lack of capacity on the ground, particularly when environment ministries, where they did exist and the capacity they did have, tends to be diminished during the conflict. So this can delay or restrict research. So we tend to be quite limited in what we can do. So we look at remote sensing and Earth observation, where you can tell a lot, but you're looking down from the sky and you don't necessarily have ground truthing. The ground truthing you can get tends to be through open source intelligence, so social media, for example. So we spend a lot of time on Twitter, Facebook, other sources, trying to identify issues and problems. And then historically, there was the kind of process of these post-conflict environmental assessments undertaken by the UN Environment Programme and other actors, but these tend to be spatially and temporally restricted. So for example, in the case of Afghanistan, there'd been 30 years of conflict before there was a post-conflict environmental assessment. So obviously you miss a huge number of things during that process. Things are a little bit different now because of these other tools that we have available to us. But one of the key issues we're lacking is this ground truthing and having people on the ground who can verify the issues that we're identifying remotely. So why we're particularly interested in civilian science or citizen science in conflict contexts. So we need to understand environmental harm in order to support assistance and post-conflict recovery. That's critical. The environment is a crucial element for livelihoods and health and all these other issues and sustainable development. So unless we truly understand the damage that's been caused, it's very difficult to identify how we should be helping and supporting communities. And yeah, very much about supporting and empowering affected communities who've obviously had many times huge collective trauma, and environmental degradation can be closely linked to that sense. As I mentioned before, there's these capacity gaps which are created by conflict. So civil society and also governmental ministries may break down, may be limited in what they can do because of the context of the conflict. So is there a way that methodologies like this can help support communities? One of the other issues is access, and this comes down to the security constraints. It may be hard for outside researchers to reach, but for the local communities, they may be able to gather data which outsiders couldn't due to security concerns. Increasingly, we really want to look at how we can make these issues more visible, because people don't tend to be particularly concerned about the environment in the context of armed conflict, because naturally people look at the direct humanitarian consequences of warfare, and there's less concern for the environment per se. And then there's also wider questions around accountability for harm, which is particularly underdeveloped at the moment. And then finally, is there a way we can use projects like this to promote environmental cooperation and peace building? So looking at how the environment can help to build peace. So why did we organize this session? As you're going to see, citizen science is already taking place in insecure conflict contexts, and that means in conflict areas, as well as areas where there may be security issues in non-conflict affected states. We think that there are many peacetime approaches, the kind of stuff that you guys are probably working on, which are readily transferable and which we'd like to hear more about. And also we're keen to network and build contacts. We're at the very start of the journey around this, and we're really keen to sort of build up perhaps a community of practice of people who are interested in pursuing projects like this in some of these conflict areas. And I shall leave it there, I think. So thank you very much. And yeah, look forward to the session.
So our first speaker is Dr. Mirella Di Lorenzo, who is the Director of Research for the Department of Chemical Engineering at the University of Bath in the UK. Hi, Morelo. Morella's interdisciplinary expertise lies at the interface of bioelectrochemistry, microengineering, microfluids, sensing technology, and material science. Her work addresses some of the world's most pressing development challenges, such as water, energy, and food security, and global health. by developing eco-friendly and sustainable solutions that are affordable to all. So I think you could paraphrase that as using very sciencey science to make important stuff that anyone can use. Over to you, Mirella.
Hi, hello. So I'll try and share my screen again. Okay. All right, so I hope you can all see my screen now. What I will talk about today is our work and experience in Colombia in a post-conflict scenario. So after the civil war, and especially our experience, our field work in the Amazon. So my area of expertise, as has been already said, is on electrochemical technologies for environmental monitoring. So the work that we have done in this area was about the development of low-cost and simple and easy-to-use technologies for water monitoring. So this was a project funded by the British Council, the Newton Fund, and it was a collaboration between the University of Bath and two universities in Colombia, Universidad de los Andes and Universidad Nacional de Bogotá. So what's the context here? So Colombia is full of gold, so gold mining is quite an intense activity, and the problem is that there are a number of mining activities for gold extraction. Only few of them are legal, and most of them are illegal, so are most small scale and artisanal mining. As you can see from these pictures, they are done without any respect of safety rules. So it exposed to the person, the miner, to a lot of risks, of health risks. But of course, it also causes a number of environmental risks because of illegal discharges of mercury that is used basically for the extraction of gold into the environment, and in particular into water systems. And of course, this is a problem, especially in remote areas and in poor areas. Of course, gold mining and the release of mercury into the environment is not just a problem of Colombia. So as you can see in this map, is a problem of Latin America in general, but also Africa and Asia. So it's quite a widespread issue. And what's the problem with the discharge of the illegal discharge of mercury in the environment? Well, the problem is the bioaccumulation of mercury in water, but also in fishes. And then, of course, this is something that affects not only the environment, but of course also the public health. Colombia is the third country in the world for contamination that is affected by mercury contamination due to the illegal mining of gold. And this, as I was saying, is a problem, especially in remote areas, because the monitoring of discharges are, there is a lack basically of monitoring of discharges into the environment, but also areas like the Amazon. In areas like the Amazon, fish is the typical food. So basically the diet of the communities in the Amazon is based on the daily consumption of fish. And therefore, the bioaccumulation in kids and in adults of mercury in these communities is really high. Of course, the risk is higher in kids because they have the mercury, a bioaccumulation of mercury coming from their parents as well, from their mom as well. So we did this field work in 2 areas of the Amazon. So we worked in Leticia here, and Leticia is basically the intersection between Brazil, Colombia, and sorry, I can't remember the third country, but anyway, Peru. Sorry, so it's basically at the cross of these 3 countries. So Leticia is basically the major city in the Colombian side of the Amazon, but also we worked into another community, which is the community of Santa Sofia, and is a more remote community. First thing that we did, so it was a team. I'm an engineer, and I was with my team from the UK of scientists, but we were also together with social scientists and with local NGOs that were basically already in contact with the community and knew the culture very well. So they were actually mediating the communication with the community. The first study that our colleagues from Colombia did was about the use of the water. So how the community used the water in the remote areas of the Amazon, and there are any sort of use of this water. So they use kids use for fun. So they play in the water. They wash clothes in the water. Water is also a means for transport and trading from one community of another. Communities in the Amazon, many communities, if not all, can only be reached via water. And of course, fishing. As I said, fish is in the daily diet of these communities. So our aim, the aim of the AguaSense project, was basically to empower these communities. A little bit as an excuse of the fact that these areas are remote, the government doesn't take any action. So there is no, at the moment, there is no monitoring of discharges and of mercury into the environment. So our idea was to provide the community themselves with the tools that they need to monitor the water and to assess the quality and safeness of the water that they consume. So we have developed an integrated sensing technology that does multiple monitors, so that monitors multiple parameters in the water. Physicochemical parameters such as pH, conductivity, dissolved oxygen, and temperature. These are the standard parameters that are normally monitored in water to assess the quality of water. But on the top of that, we also added some chemical monitoring of mercury, lead, cadmium, and copper. So the idea is that the technology used sends those factors, those parameters in the water, then the data collected are transferred into a mobile device, such as a telephone, a mobile telephone, and then data are collected into an interactive map that is public and can be accessed by everyone. So the idea here was basically to create an evidence that government cannot ignore, and to give, of course, this tool into the hands of the community themselves. So this is basically some images of what we have done. So we've done some testing into the 2 sites I mentioned, so Leticia and Santa Sofia. And here you see how the technology works. This is the sensing probe. This is screen printed electrode, and the data are transmitted into a mobile phone and then converted into numbers into an interactive map. But as I said, there was a lot of work to be done with the community, because the idea there is to empower them. The idea is that they are the ones that are monitoring themselves the water. They're going to be use the technology. So when you start in a community, the first thing to do is to develop a relationship of trust. So they, first of all, need to understand that We are not there to because we want something from them, or because we are going with our own agenda for our own interest, but we're doing something for them and with them. So this is the reason why the help from the social scientists was key, because they knew also the social structure of the community. So there is a leader in these indigenous communities around the Amazon, and the leader is called Kurasa. So we need to, first of all, communicate with the Kurasa. We need to talk to him, and we had to explain him what was our mission and what we wanted to do. Then there was a meeting with the key representatives of the community, where basically the Kurasa was, once the Kurasa accepted our presence in the community, the Kurasa was then explaining to the community representatives our role and the significance of our work. And then we've done a lot of activities for capacity building and technology transfer and training with the community, but it was a mutual type of interaction, because we were learning from them, from their experience, their view of the problem, and we were then transfer our technology knowledge. And this type of mutual discussion happened via questionnaires and some role games that we've done, and interviews that we've done with the community. So all our activities, initial activities with the communities, were about the understanding their perception of the water that they use, whether the water, they believe that the water is contaminated, whether they believe that the malformation, of babies is due to the consumption of the water. They problem at the belly is caused by the water, and also to understand what is their perception on how this problem can be prevented. So what is caused the risk, and how it can be prevented. And then, of course, we've done a lot of training on the use of the technology themselves, so how basically they can do the monitoring themselves, and how and what actually the data that they collect mean. Of course, there were a lot of challenges, and of course, in the communication and trying to work with them. But of course, we were working with social scientists, and we were working in a condition where basically the community was already well known, and the culture was well known. But there were also some challenges related to the environmental conditions, so the extreme climate condition of the Amazon. I don't know if you have ever been there, because it's extremely hot and humid, which is also a problem for the electrical systems that we were using. The other challenges was on the use of the technology themselves, because of course we come as specialists, as the experts, and what we think is easy, and we realize it's not that intuitive and that easy for the community. So we have spotted a lot of mistakes that we made, and a lot of ways of how basically we had to make a lot of suggestions on how to make the technology even more intuitive and and easy to use. But of course, the other problem is, right, we give this tool to the community, they are able to monitor the water, the quality of water, but what can we do when the water is not safe and they don't have any other source of water? So basically, what do we do with the data generated? So this caused a lot of challenges, and then basically we have been developed some other projects on the treatment as well. So this is a very short talk. I just wanted to highlight basically the importance of participatory design. So we, as the technology experts, have basically the mission to develop technologies that can enhance the quality of life of people, can protect communities and the environment, but technologies cannot be uptaken by the end users if it's not developed together with them. So it is very important if this process happens together, if the technology development happens together with the involvement with the communities, so that there is a mutual understanding of needs, and there is and there must be necessarily a lot of training with the community. And I consider this like a mutual communication and growth, because we are learning from both sides. So I thank you very much. I hope there were no problems in the understanding and in following. And this is the first time that I'm giving a talk online. I just want to talk all the people behind my work and the sponsors. And thank you for your attention. Sharing now.
Many thanks, Mirella. So next I'd like to welcome Mazin Qumsiyeh, who is joining us from Bethlehem. Mazin is a Bedouin in cyberspace, a villager at home, and an inspiration to thousands. He's also a professor at Bethlehem University and has previously served on the faculties at Yale and Duke universities. He's a founder and volunteer director of the Palestine Museum of Natural History and the Palestine Institute of Biodiversity and Sustainability. Mazin has published more than 140 scientific papers on topics ranging from cultural heritage to biodiversity to cancer. And I would love to know the tally of his emails from Palestine now. So over to you, Mazin.
Thank you. It's about 50-some thousand emails that receive my email. What I want to talk about today is briefly what we are doing here with getting citizens involved via volunteerism and citizen science, and then hopefully we'll have some discussion about the subject. I want you to just realize that we are very lucky in being geographically in this part of the world. Of course, this part of the world is where humans first developed agriculture. Also, it's a part of the world where most of humanity traces its origins, because when we came out of Africa, we all came through Palestine. And even birds today still recognize this and go up back and forth between Eurasia and Africa through Palestine. Of course, we have a conflict. The conflict is related to the idea of changing a country that was multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious state called Palestine, to make it the Jewish state of Israel. And this, by necessity, engaged the removal of 530 Palestinian villages and towns, which you see on the left map, destruction of these towns, ethnic cleansing of the people. And then the people who are left are squeezed into Bantustans or ghettos, which are now in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and the Galilee a bit and the Negev. In total, those areas that are left for us are about 8.3% of the historic land of Palestine. This is the core of the conflict that made 7.5 million Palestinians refugees or displaced people. And of course, there are environmental and other ramifications of this. For example, Jewish colonial settlements built on Palestinian land, like this hill on Jabal Abu Ghnaim. This is what it looked like on the top in 1997 and what it looks like at the bottom today. Also, Israeli industrial settlements had dumped their toxic waste on the Palestinian population, and my students did some studies on this. Now, we are obviously, as a people, very interested in diversity of nature and diversity of society. We believe in diversity. This is a picture from 1932 Palestine, where religious and secular leaders, Muslims, Christians, and Jewish, Baha'i, etc., native people who lived here of various backgrounds in relative harmony with nature, managed to survive without any problems together for hundreds and thousands of years. And here they are objecting to the idea of transformation to a monolithic society and culture. Now, what is our role, and how can we challenge colonization and its activities in the destruction of our environment while engaging our young people? And this has to start very, very early in life. So we started the Museum of Natural History because it's basically in a botanical garden. It's basically a method for attracting young people and getting them engaged in science, getting them engaged in exploration and discovery. And our motto is basically is respect for ourselves as Palestinians, respect for others regardless of their background or religion, etc., and respect for the environment. And our ultimate mission and goals are, or vision, if you want, is sustainable human and natural communities. And for that, we need people to be engaged. We need people to engage with citizen science. Now, in this room, actually, I have some volunteers and others who were working with us, and we engage with students who volunteer to collect data and do research on various aspects. We also started a group called Palestine Action for the Planet, and the idea is to mobilize people and mobilize both native people and also in collaboration with internationals and others who want to help us to be able to affect change locally and, of course, globally. So this is part of Extinction Rebellion and others. We hold meetings, we do activities. Our challenges, of course, are numerous under situations of conflict. They include colonization activities, lack of freedom of movement, the fact that Israel doesn't allow us even, don't allow us to receive basic supplies we need, but also even internationals who volunteer sometimes are denied entry at the border because we are under colonial occupation. Israel controls all entry and exit. So the native people are deprived of any support. We also have a lack of resources and poverty and carried on us by the colonial occupiers. The idea, as you know, is they want a land without a people so that they can create a Jewish state. So this is what they do. And this is our vision is to build this institute as an institute for biodiversity and sustainability, a museum of natural history. We have now a small museum. We do have a botanical garden, about 12 dunums, in which we have a community garden, which refugees, for example, come, even refugee children used to come. Now with the coronavirus, we have less of these kinds of activities, but hopefully it'll come back. The students would come, plant, grow their own food stuff, etc. We're trying to preserve traditional methods of agriculture and traditional methods of a relationship to the environment in ways that protects the environment. I will stop here because there's a lot I can be talking about, but of course, you know, we can take always questions and answers and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mazin. Okay, so we had intended to go to our speaker from Somalia next. However, he seems to be having some connectivity issues. So we're going to take a couple of questions for the speakers that have already been on. Mirella, a question from Nora Salas-Sioni. Did the population have knowledge about the negative effects of water on their health? Did you find defiance towards the idea that water was causing their health problems?
So it was quite contradictory. Yes, most of them realized that it was when they were drinking. Sometimes that the belly pain was associated to drinking water. The problem is that this is when actually they were drinking water in the dry season, when water is heavily contaminated with microorganisms. The issue with mercury contamination is not as direct. I mean, you can drink water contaminated by mercury, you can eat the fish contaminated by mercury, but you don't see the effects directly on the same day or the day after. So that was the trickiest to let them understand. Also because gold mining is a source of good, actually, money and income for the community. So they do realize that there is that the kids have a lot of malformations, but it's quite tricky for them to connect it to the fact that they are eating the fish or because of the illegal activities, artisanal activities that they are doing. So and this is actually what we were trying and do with the help of the social scientists, and also with eating fish. There are different types of fishes that so the level of risk on eating fish is different, because of course eating a big fish that eats smaller fishes has got a higher risk, because it contains more mercury. Of course, so the bioaccumulation of mercury is higher. So we were just trying and educate to eat less fish, and also to eat some specific type of fish, but it's not that easy. This is something they would just tell you, this is something that my parents were doing, my grandparents were doing, we've always been doing that, it cannot be this the reason. So I'm afraid, no, it's not that easy to let them understand the cause of the problem, and that's why it requires a lot of work and a lot of activities together.
Thanks, Mirella. So next we have a question for Mazin from Mookie Hackley. Thank you very much, Mazin. Your situation is an ongoing conflict and restrictions. So is the act of collecting information about biodiversity putting participants in any risk? How do you guide your participants?
Well, yes, we have been at risk, of course, from the inability to reach areas we want to study and protect, number one. And number two, as I mentioned, the resources that are allowed in for us. The fact that everything we do here is considered an act of resistance, even when it involves education, conservation of our environment, etc., are considered acts of resistance that are prohibited by the colonial occupiers, or not encouraged, not supported, and certainly challenged in ways. So yes, I mean, we try to do things under very difficult circumstances, and we do succeed to some extent. As I always tell my students, when there's a way, if they put their mind to it, they'll find ways around it. We have projects, for example, of collaboration with our colleagues, Palestinians in the Galilee, and I am, as a Palestinian, I'm not allowed to cross into Jerusalem or go to the Galilee, certainly. Because we have a pass system, as they called it in South Africa under apartheid, where the Bantustans are separated from each other. The same for us, you know, the restrictions on movement and so forth. You know, the inability to get the human resources we need, the support we need, and international exchanges that we need as academia, as institutions concerned for biodiversity and for protection and for study of our nature is very difficult. When we submit papers, when we write the name Palestine on it, and geographically this is still Palestine, many times journals get very sensitive. They have either Zionist editors or somebody who doesn't like the idea of using the name Palestine, and I'm not going to change what I write because, as I said, geographically it's still Palestine. So preventing us even from publishing sometimes in good journals, because these journals are trying to be quote unquote politically correct by accommodating the occupiers, colonizers of our land. And I could speak about many other challenges, but we believe we can transcend this. Most of the occupation, as I always also say, is mental occupation, mental colonization. And if we get rid of the mental colonization, the physical colonization becomes easier to deal with.
Thanks, Mazin. Okay, so our next speaker is Mohamed Farah. Mohamed is a co-director of a social enterprise called ECOSOC, which has got to be one of the most exciting social enterprises I've ever come across. They're based in Mogadishu in Somalia, and they address key challenges from plastic pollution and waste collection to youth unemployment through manufacturing construction materials from recycled plastic. Okay, so over to you, Mohamed. Oh, I should say ECOSOC is the Somalian partner for World Cleanup Day, which is an international civic movement that unites millions of people in over 180 countries across the world. Mohamed?
Can you hear me? Hello?
Hi. A little jerky, but I think you can start.
Hi, morning.
I guess the internet in Mogadishu may be somewhat sketchy.
My voice clear because my connection is weak.
You're kind of coming and going.
Your voice from your side is broken.
Okay, so I think Doug is going to run through Mohamed's slides. So over to you, Doug.
Thanks, Leonie. Can you hear me okay? Okay, yeah, Mohamed, terribly sorry about this. I think our internet in West Yorkshire is about as sketchy as that in Mogadishu. Yeah, I'm not going to do justice to your slides, but hopefully you can join us properly for the Q&A afterwards. So, as Leonie said, ECOSOC is a social enterprise based in Mogadishu. It seeks to address climate change and plastic pollution. Clearly, Somalia has been affected for decades by civil war and conflict, and that's had a significant impact on Somalia's infrastructure. ECOSOC assisted with the drafting of a national environment policy and environment management bill, and 80% of the country is ASAL land, which I'm not quite sure what that is, but we can ask Mohamed in the Q&A. So the main problem that they've been working on is this issue of plastic solid waste. So 60% of Mogadishu's waste goes uncollected. 3,800 tons of waste every day is generated, 58% of which is plastic waste, and less than 1% currently gets recycled, and more than 90% gets dumped. So there's a huge solid waste management issue in Mogadishu. The solution, so ECOSOC have been working on this question of can they recycle this plastic waste into useful materials, building materials, so that's bricks for walls, tiles for roofs, and structural beams. So the designs that they've been looking at is plastic extrusion and recycling, so it transforms post-consumer waste plastic into roof tiles and bricks and beams. Participating customers, they download their app, which they developed, and it lets the user share the location and district zone. The app shows their location in the city, the type of plastic waste to be collected and at what time it should be collected. And then they then send out their tipper trucks and youth to go and collect the plastic waste, which is then turned into these recycled products. Obviously in Mogadishu, there are security issues which need to be addressed through their work. Pretty serious challenges, so over 300 direct deaths of environmental workers and waste collectors who are either targeted or they can be killed by remote controlled IEDs, which are hidden in trash bins along the roads and can kill them during cleanup days. They have generally very limited ability to carry out environmental impact assessments due to risks of kidnapping and bombings, very little CSR, and obviously they have difficulty finding volunteers. Obviously there are concerns that they might be killed or injured in the line of duty. However, they think they've got some transferable ideas based on their experience there. One of them obviously persistence and spirit of resilience, which clearly for most Somalis is a fundamental part of their daily life. The technologies they've developed, they think can be readily transferred. Clearly solid waste, plastic pollution is a massive issue globally. Very little is recycled, particularly in the global south and in the global north. But with these solutions, I think they can address some of these problems. And then this question of public awareness is key. So even in these conflict contexts, it's still possible to get people to engage on environmental issues in their communities. They also had support from international community. So ECOSOC and their work is part of a much larger group who run World Cleanup Day. And that's active in many countries around the world, including many conflict-affected countries like Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. And again, this is an app-based approach to identify solid waste for cleanup. And then also political lobbying, which can be impactful and help to create the environment where these projects can flourish. And finally, their goals is to withdraw and recycle more than 2.5 million kilograms of plastic over the next 5 years, prevent 2,500 tons of CO2 emissions from dump sites and incinerators, and obviously create jobs in the local community. And yeah, Mohamed, I really hope you can join us for the Q&A, and I hope I did justice to your PowerPoint. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. Sorry, apologies. I've got a question here to Mazin from Julia Locke. Is there any kind of support that would be useful to you and your colleagues from us as the citizen science community? So that's a question for Mazin. Okay, I'll go to a question to Mirella. Were there any hostile or other interactions or reactions from the gold mining stakeholders?
We haven't really engaged with the big stakeholders, but just with the communities. And of course, yes, there are a lot of we had some difficulties with government bodies that we thought were on our side, like environmental government bodies that I mean, of course, you need to understand that the situation in Colombia can be very corrupted. So, not really. I realized I was quite naive when then because once we were there, we didn't receive the support from those we thought were going to support us. That's the thing. When you are doing this sort of activities, you are somehow entering in a complex context, and it's quite hard to do it on your own. You have to mediate with the right people. So it's not just the contact with the communities, but you need also some good communication with governmental bodies. But in a nutshell, yes, we had a lot of difficulties, and it's actually because of these difficulties that currently this project has been interrupted, so we haven't unfortunately continued with our work there.
Thanks, Mirella. So I'll take a couple of general questions now. From Petra Benyi. This was initially directed at Mazin, but I think there's a kind of general question behind it. Given the multiple threats, i.e. poverty, occupation and violence, I guess it's harder to make biodiversity an interesting or motivating topic. Any tips on motivations? So, yeah, because of all of the other problems that people face because of conflicts, how do you get them to engage on the environment?
Actually, we found that it's fairly straightforward when we consider the environment as a heritage. Native people by nature want to protect their heritage. The heritage includes cultural heritage. It also includes environmental natural heritage. When we use cultural heritage, for example, as I mentioned, Palestine is part of the Fertile Crescent, where our ancestors first developed agriculture. So our cultural heritage is actually also our environmental heritage because we're connected to the land. And so using this aspect gives a lot of motivation to young people, old people, etc. When we talk to, for example, young people, whether they have pride in what their grandparents and how they lived and how they were living in harmony with nature without producing solid waste and so forth. This is very motivating to them, and I think they dig deep into their own hearts and minds about love of the land, love of their country, and this allows them to engage with us at a much deeper level than if I just told them, well, we have to protect the environment because we need fresh air or something. It's really important that they use. I actually wrote an article about nature as a form of resistance and how we transcend mental colonization by working with nature, by going out into nature on a daily basis, by connecting to the soil, to the land, to the agriculture, and so forth. So this I think can be used in many native communities. The native people, the indigenous people around the world have the wisdom to connect to the land and save the land, and we need to listen to them actually. And in this, we can very much succeed despite the challenges.
Thank you. Morelo, did you want to comment on that question?
Sorry, I'm having internet issues. Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, so given the multiple problems that people in a conflict affected area face, how do you get them to engage on the environment?
Yeah, that's exactly actually what I was saying at the beginning. The environment normally is the one left behind. And it's a tricky question, to be honest, because because I don't know the answer. It's just that, of course, there are different priorities in a conflict, and the environment is not considered one of them. I think what is important again comes with training and with education, understanding that actually the problem with the environmental is not considering to affect directly the communities. It actually does. So I think it's again an issue of discussing and talking and promoting that actually any problem to the environment is a problem to society as well.
Thanks, Mirella. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Owen Derbyshire now, who's going to give us a bit of a synthesis of the comments we've heard so far.
Yeah, thanks, Leonie, and all our panelists as well. It's a real shame that we couldn't get our colleague from Somalia in, and I guess there's a lesson there in terms of different people's access to the internet and things like that. So I'm just going to sum up the kind of range of challenges that we've identified in those presentations. And then if we can have a bit of a Q&A, we've already got some really good questions come in, but if people want to carry on sending them in, and we can kind of, on the back of identifying those challenges, try and think of some ways around them and some potential solutions going forward. So I think the main challenges of operating citizen science projects in these fragile contexts are, well, in order of kind of importance. The first one is violence and intimidation, and the difficulty in finding volunteers. I think especially with the presentation from Somalia and ECOSOC, that was really made very clear. Another one is the suspicion of people when you first arrive, and trying to develop a relationship of trust between them and use existing structures and civil society organisations. But in conflict zones, that can be very difficult because people have different agendas and people do have these heightened suspicions. I guess there's also, if it's a circumstance where you're getting an outsider kind of going into the country and trying to do work, there's going to be other language and culture issues, and maybe not even an understanding of what citizen science is, how it works, why people might be expected to do something for no kind of compensation. And I think finally the other big challenge is the lack of resources available, and that's both at the local level but also in connecting to broad people internationally, which I think Mazin kind of quite nicely captured. So I also just want to recall some of the comments that have been made in the chat. So there's a nice one here from Alice S, who's from UCL. So she's saying, I recall a story of a Japanese community who had to collectively talk to a local industry releasing mercury into the water after a great deal of them became unwell. They had to argue for many years, and I think that's relating to your presentation, Mirella. And Nadia Dewhurst Richmond, she says, there could be a wealth of lessons to be learnt in terms of safety, ethics, and having an impact on national policy from efforts to use participatory monitoring of water quality in Bangladesh, which is maybe not a conflict location, but is similarly a place with similar kind of development issues, maybe. And because the source of the water quality issues there was from government-owned factories. So I think we're going to now move on to the more general kind of high-level Q&A section, which I believe, Leonie, you now have the questions for. So if I pass over to you.
Thanks, Owen. So we've got a question from Mookie Hackley to everybody. Conflict and post-conflict situations are full of different narratives by different communities and groups. How does that influence the design of the project? Morelo, would you like to comment on that? How different narratives in conflict and post-conflict situations affects the design?
Sorry, I was actually writing down my my answer. So I would say that in each the lesson learned that we could actually generalize to any situation is to understand what's the background of the place where we are working with, the community we're working with, the society. So we need to have a very deep understanding on where we are going to act. Very often is so at least what I have observed. I've done also other work in Brazil in a completely different setup and a completely different work. But what I've observed is that it's easy to engage with the community themselves. The real problem is the involvement of stakeholders like governmental bodies and those actually that have the power to change things, because of course there are other interests that move those stakeholders. So I would say that the only way to easily adapt a specific type of work in different narratives is to work with a team that knows very well what these narratives are. So that have a very clear understanding of the scenario, have a very clear understanding of the background where we are acting. And they have an understanding of the culture and an understanding on how to engage and involve the people, the communities that are directly affected, but they also have an understanding on how the other things works, how we can engage with the governmental bodies, with those stakeholders that have a tangible and a real power in changing the things. I would say that alone, without this background, without this knowledge, we cannot make any difference.
If I may add to those points.
Yes, please.
It's important as a species. Can you hear me all? As a species, I think we are at a dangerous point in human history. And I think joint solidarity and working together, we can transcend the difficulties that are facing us, be it climate change, risk of nuclear war, etc. But that requires informed, educated citizens. That does not come, of course, from the mainstream media that is constantly inundating us with ideas of consumerism and GDPs and development and all this nonsense. We need to go back and again listen to the voices of the communities of the native people, whether it's Zapatistas in Mexico or people in Palestine or in Somalia or anywhere else, and start to think about how do we get our species on a more stable, sustainable path rather than this endless consumerism and endless destruction, basically. And we cannot do it in one spot, because it doesn't help me if I protect the environment in, let's say, Somalia, and the world is burning in California. It really is important for us to connect and build a network of people who are concerned, who are all considered citizen science activists, if you want, not just citizen scientists in terms of collecting data, but in terms of acting. I think this is what we need as a species. We need to get to work very hard, much larger than what we have been doing.
Thanks, Mazin. So the next question is from Julia Locke. How do we protect citizen scientists in conflict zones, i.e. protect their identity, provide secure communication channels, etc.? I wonder if there are any synergies or collaborations between citizen scientists and citizen journalists in conflict zones. I
think, yeah, Doug and others probably have ideas. There's actually material written on some of this in the literature. But the key to it, again, is better information, better communication. I'm very pleased with this session, actually. It opens venues for us with other people. And we should start to think about building these networks whereby we need to engage journalists, especially journalists who work on alternative media, and get them to cover what's happening on the ground. There are many Palestinian scientists that are now sitting in Israeli jails who have not even seen a judge because Israel holds them in administrative detention without seeing a judge or a lawyer. And it's important that we protect these people. It's important that we publicize their stories in the West and around the world. And it's important that we work together. Maybe create a website that's specifically for these purposes. I think it would be good from the association to do this. I'm happy to help with this. I put my email in the chat if people want to contact me, and I'm happy to work on this. With a few volunteers to work with us on this, and maybe Mirella has something to add, and Doug.
Thanks. Mirella, did you want to comment on that?
I had to realize, so yes, I don't know, I'm having a little bit of internet issues. I hope you can hear me. Yeah?
Yep.
Okay, so I move on. I had to realize very soon when I was there that actually we end up doing some political work as well, which I didn't feel comfortable about because I was thinking I'm a scientist and my job is just to be a scientist. But yeah, I think it is unavoidable for the type of work that we're doing and the type of participation with the community themselves that we undertake somehow also a different role from the proper from the one we are used to, from the scientific role. So having journalists on board, it's surely helpful. Yeah, I think it's surely helpful.
Okay, thanks. So this is maybe a question for Doug, but also there's we could take some general thoughts. Are there any international agreements about environmental issues in conflict situations?
Cool. Thanks, Leonie. Mr. Mike. Yeah, there are international agreements concerning the environmental protection during conflict. So international humanitarian law has some very weak provisions for the protection of the environment. There are supposed to be some restrictions on, for example, targeting sites with dangerous forces. That might be dams or dikes or nuclear power stations. There are some restrictions on damaging parts of the environment which are necessary for the survival of the civilian population. So that might be avoiding, for example, destroying crops or agriculture. But in general, protections of the environment are pretty weak. And over the last 10 years, we've seen a very significant sort of change in attention. So the main protections to the environment were developed in the 1970s after the Vietnam War, where you'd had this massive use of aerial defoliants, Agent Orange, and destruction of forests in Vietnam. And they were very much of their time. Whereas now, over the last 10 years, we've had this development where we're now looking at having this set of 28 legal principles, which is being developed by UN lawyers, which cover every element of conflict. So during conflict, things that should be done before conflict, things that should be done after conflict, such as post-conflict assessment and assistance, and also what should be done in situations of occupation. And that's one of the kind of particularly interesting areas where the law of occupation, which dates back to the early 20th century, didn't really have much to say about environmental protection. Had some work around natural resources, but now with these new principles, they're kind of integrating environmental human rights into protections for the occupied population. So at the moment, there's kind of this big surge to look at all these different fields of law: international humanitarian law, domestic environmental law, human rights law, and try and develop this kind of new, stronger framework protecting the environment. Obviously, there's a huge gap between these laws being developed and them actually being implemented on the ground and them influencing the behavior of states parties and parties to conflicts. And they're mostly aimed at states and not necessarily to non-state actors. So, for example, in Colombia, you would have had FARC and ELN. ELN for decades have been blowing up oil pipelines and infrastructure. Islamic State in Iraq blowing up oil infrastructure. So there's this question of the laws which will be there, will they necessarily, how do you influence the behavior of non-state armed groups as well as influencing states? But we're in a better place now in terms of the protections that are there. And actually one of the ways you could encourage implementation is to make sure we've got data on environmental harm in conflicts. And obviously one of the ways to get that is through citizen science, as well as some of the other work we do around remote sensing. That was quite a long answer. Thanks.
Mirella, did you want to comment on that question?
Yeah, I think my only question was that how do you ensure that those agreements are respected when there is a conflict, and also especially in areas where remote areas like the Amazon is so difficult to reach that it's so easy to forget about that. I mean, that's really the excuse that the government takes, that it's difficult to reach. So how, even though there are agreements, how do you ensure that those are respected when, and when there is a conflict? Of course, you cannot just go there and check.
Doug, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think it's a huge challenge. You know, at the moment we have seen massive breaches of international humanitarian law more generally, with the targeting of schools, the targeting of hospitals. We'll see the targeting of the environment, and if we can't get states to not, and non-state actors to not target schools and hospitals, then what hope do we have for them not targeting the environment? So it's fatalistic in some respects, but we would always need to expect there will be some degree of environmental damage during conflicts. And the question is, how do we respond to that? And how can we address that and assist those communities who've been impacted by it in the post-conflict phase?
I mean, if I may just interject one thing. I mean, politicians, what they do is they stick their finger in the air and see where the wind is blowing. And what we have to do is mobilize enough people, and that has to be done via information. Secrecy is the biggest problem for environmental conservation, as we saw with the pipelines in the US, for example, or with other places. You know, Israel, when they did this canal between the Red Sea and the Dead Sea and pressured Jordan to take it, basically, it's environmentally catastrophic. But they kept secret what information they had. And also they did this choppy environmental impact assessment done by a beneficiary of the project, basically. And so, so it was a very poor information exchange that allows mega projects and destruction of Amazons and other places to go on. And so what our role is really as scientists and as citizen scientists is to expose and inform and mobilize people. And I think that's what we have to do. And the more information we put out via social media and other things, the more successful we will be. And we were successful here in a few instances by mobilizing information power, if you want.
So that leads quite nicely onto the next question, which is, are you concerned that the environmental data that you collect could be weaponized by parties to a conflict? So I guess that could be in terms of creating potential targets, or false information or misinformation, reinforcing a certain party to the conflict's narrative. Invite anybody to speak on that.
Well, I mean, to start with, of course, colonizers and oppressors always weaponize information about the environment to their advantage. I give you a very simple example. When Israel destroyed those 500 plus Palestinian villages and towns, they destroyed all the trees that are around them, which were very rich in diversity, agro-biodiversity, including figs, almonds, olives, etc. and they went ahead and planted pine trees, a monoculture of pine trees, European pine trees, because they grow very fast. And then they weaponized that by saying, look, we're planting trees, we're making the desert green, blah, blah. And this is all just misinformation, because obviously this was not a desert. This was part of the Fertile Crescent. Even in their own Bible, it says land of milk and honey that God told them to go to. So it was always a rich land with agriculture, with other resources that the natives lived off. So they weaponize in saying that they have made the desert green, you know, and this is greenwashing, if you want, that colonizers do sometimes. When the European colonizers destroyed 2 million buffaloes in North America, for example, and they also claimed they're bringing progress and development and environmentalism and protected areas and all this stuff into North America.
Thanks. Doug, did you want to make any comments on weaponization of environmental information?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think the issue is that maybe we need to flip the question round. So environmental information in conflicts is being weaponized, will be weaponized, and what could these kind of projects do to prevent that and address that? So yeah, we've seen this kind of big upsurge in the kind of weaponization of environmental information during conflicts, which is being sort of mediated by social media. Obviously, there's far more information flying around than previously the case. It's always been an issue in conflicts, but it's kind of becoming accelerated in recent years. We see it in every conflict we look at, particularly Eastern Ukraine, Yemen. You know, it's a major issue. So the question we're interested in is, well, how could these projects prevent that by, particularly if they're projects which bring in communities from both sides of the conflict who are working together to collect this data, by ensuring that your results are completely transparent, or as transparent as they can be, while still protecting the participants of the project. So yeah, just kind of flipping this on its head and using this as a way of actually depoliticizing environmental data in the context of conflicts.
Hi, sorry. Is the best approach to get both good data and participant engagement to tackle some of the challenges with simple solutions, e.g. paper and pen surveys, or technological things such as apps or small sensors? It's a question from the audience. Anybody like to comment?
In short, yes.
Okay. So as you have both been talking, Mirella and Mazin, I've been kind of reflecting on the differences in your backgrounds and approach. Mirella, you're based in a Western university using very highly developed kind of scientific methods and thinking about connecting with communities in a very different context to Mazin. You're very much embedded in the community and part of the struggle there. And I'm wondering, yeah, given this kind of big difference in experiences and challenges, what are the kind of things that unites this process of citizen science in conflict zones?
Mirella, you wanna unmute? Okay. I mean, I can.
Probably very sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll type the question if Mazin, if you want to speak, and I'll type it for Morelo.
Sure. I mean, when you look at the challenges facing indigenous communities, they could use support. And I am in a situation where I'm actually privileged more than most of the people around me, my fellow citizens, my relatives, etc., because I got my education in the West, etc., and I'm doing relatively well compared to, for example, people in Gaza with 80% unemployment. I was actually on a conference call with a mentee that I help mentor students in Gaza, and the situation there is really, really bad. And when people around us here with very high unemployment, it's very hard sometimes. Of course, you have challenges if you're going to teach children, for example, not to use a slingshot to kill a bird and they are really hungry. It's not easy. So privileged communities and people coming from privileged communities, including myself, have to be sensitive to certain things and certain considerations with the native people. And but doesn't mean we can't do a lot. We can do a lot, and we can teach people how to produce their own foods, even from a small backyard with limited water and limited resources. We do aquaponics here, other things, and we teach them how to not use pesticides, how to compost, how to recycle trash to make useful things from it. So there's a lot of things that can be done to empower people, and we do it, but do it with sensitivity. And I think Mirella, as in her talk, talked about this a bit of how we can do it from people. So I welcome here in Palestine people like Mirella and others who want to come and work with us on these aspects, because there's always contributions they can give.
Okay, thanks. I think we've lost Morelo, but Doug, did you want to comment on that question?
Yeah, I think the Mike. Yeah, I think Mazin's point is a good one. It's this question of how can we make these connections between those in the more privileged West and those in fragile states and states in insecure contexts. Yeah, and maybe that is something we should look at. Maybe one of the things we should carry away from this session is how can we get this conversation going. I was just thinking, when we were looking at other potential speakers, new people who could be involved in this event, and there are more things out there going on in these settings than you immediately give credit for. So, for example, in Eastern Ukraine, there was a project which used a Google Maps based app to record damaged buildings that had been damaged by shelling, and that involved UN Development Program, but also a web startup in Ukraine. And so in terms of the kind of stakeholders involved in these projects, it's not just scientists and researchers, it's also these web companies, it's also international organizations and humanitarian organizations. And similarly, at the weekend was doing a project which Fauna and Flora International did in South Sudan, and that was via Zooniverse, and they had thousands of trail cam images which had been recorded by rangers who work for Fauna and Flora International in South Sudan. It wasn't particularly safe for their staff, their Western staff, to get on the ground because of the conflict. And so they set up a Zooniverse thing where you can go through and help them identify different wildlife in these thousands of photos. So again, you're bringing in community from outside the conflict zone to help with research on the ground in these settings where it would be too dangerous. So there are a lot more people and organizations and institutions out there doing this kind of thing, and there's kind of a need to map this and to develop networks to see how all these different actors can mutually support. Folk like Mohamed in Somalia and Mazin in Palestine, who would really benefit from these connections being forged.
Okay, just take one last question before going on to Owen to sum up. Would payment for citizen science, if difficulty in crossing cultural barriers, help or hinder good data collection? Mazin, what's your thoughts on that?
I didn't get that. With what?
So we've got somebody asking about payment for citizen science and whether that could help or hinder good data collection.
I mean, so far we have been very successful relying on volunteer efforts. We've had hundreds of local volunteers and international volunteers the incentives, or financial incentives, are not always the most important, kind of incentive for people. It's really like when they publish, when they have their name on a paper, when they get recognition in their community, they find that that's very useful to them. And so we use more of that. Doesn't mean we don't give financial incentives. I actually support many of my students who can't afford tuition, and all I ask them if they want and to do something in return is to engage and help their communities, and that includes citizen science kind of work. So I think that financial incentives, as important as they are not everything, and we need to think of the social, psychological, and other needs of people and how to address them: friendship, teamwork, etc.
Okay, thanks, Mazin. So I'm going to hand over to Owen now to give us a quick wrap up. Owen, you're muted. I think Mazin needs to leave, so I just want to say thank you and goodbye to Mazin. Thanks ever so much for joining us.
Okay, yeah, bye Mazin, and thanks to all our panelists. We have been beset by some internet problems across all of us, so also a big thank you to ECSA for kind of putting up with that. So I think that was a really interesting session, and I hope people started thinking about some new things. I guess people might be thinking, what are the next steps? So I'm just going to try and do a screen share. First of all, with the immediate next step, which is to go to the Zoom coffee break room, which we will be in. I think Mazin's had to leave, so I don't think he'll be there. Mirella, I think, is having internet problems, and Mohamed has also had internet problems throughout. Thinking further afield, it would be great to kind of use the energy from this session to kind of get more involved in new projects or in projects with people like Mazin. And we've actually set up a Google form for collaboration. Unfortunately, my computer is crashing and it won't let me share screen. So the link for that I cannot currently put up on the screen, so sorry about that. But we will, I can't paste it either because I've got a not responding on the StreamYard. Sorry. But if either Leonie or Doug could paste that into the chat, and then we can use that Google form as a place where people can sign up, and we can think about future events and future projects and future collaborations and ways to overcome many of the different challenges we've kind of identified today. So I think with that, I think a big thank you to everyone, and see you in the coffee break room.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.